Chapter 4. Waking up slowly, my eyes opened to be greeted with the same sight as the day before. And sadly, the day before that. I had been in the hospital for 3 days already, largely unsure of what was going on. The nurse had let me get up and stretch, walking around occasionally, but she hadn't wanted me leaving her care for a couple of days. She said it was to make sure that I was at full strength again, but I knew the dangers of a concussion without needing her to say anything. Besides, it's not like I really had anywhere else to go. Once I left here, I was essentially on the street. Aside from her checkups, we didn't really talk all that much. Something told me I had made a pretty bad impression on her that first day, and she was a little nervous around me. There was a second nurse who apparently shared responsibilities at this clinic as well. Nurse Tenderheart, I believe. They dressed similarly, but she seemed quite a bit more unsure of herself than Nurse Redheart. I didn't see much of her regardless, aside from checking in occasionally. The first day that I had woken up, I discovered several books on my bedside table, with a note resting on top of them. It was written in very small, delicate handwriting that had an odd sense of precision to it. Somehow, I had guessed it was from Twilight before I even read it.
Mr. Earth Pony, it's unfortunate that I don't know your name, but I had to leave you a message. I'm sorry I couldn't have been there when you woke up after our session, but I was unsure of when you would, and I have my duties at the library to attend to. The nurse mentioned that you would be there for several days, so I decided you should probably get as acclimatized as possible. The best way to go about that, of course, is books. I've loaned you several on different subject matters about our world and magic. I thought you might find those interesting. When you get released, feel free to return the books to the library. I'd like to talk in length with you about your memories and the events surrounding your arrival in Ponyville. I obviously deeply respect your privacy, and so I won't go into details in this letter. May Celestia bless you with a speedy recovery, and I hope to see you in a few days. Your new friend, Twilight Sparkle.
I'd read it dozens of times in the past 2 days since I awoke. 3 books were stacked in an extremely orderly fashion under the note, alphabetized and in very good condition. I smiled almost immediately when I saw them. Seeing the work of someone else can tell you quite a lot about them. She seemed to be an organized, tidy individual, and definitely loved books. Of course, I had no problems with books either. They were often better company than others could be, I felt. It was a strange sensation, having a certain feeling and desire, but not really knowing why. I knew that I enjoyed the company of written text, though, and losing myself in a good story. I didn't need memories for that, as I had a perfect example the last 2 days. The first book was simple, a geographical study of Equestria. It listed major cities, gave information about them, and went into basic information about the land itself and what was there. Apple crops appeared to be heavily influential in this region, maintained by a healthy amount of earth ponies. I guessed Applejack had something to do with that, vaguely recalling apples on her flank. The next book, Historical Documentation and Important Dates, was what you would expect. I was mostly interested in the cultural statements it made and in how things were run, of course. 2 goddesses, then 1, and now back to 2. That last part wasn't in the book, as it was a bit of an older read, and I was surprised to acknowledge that it had recently changed again. Of course, they weren't called goddesses, but princesses. I idly wondered how accurate the statement was in the first place. Were they truly physical goddesses? This Celestia that I kept hearing about was one of them. Apparently, her younger sister Luna had recently returned from exile and redeemed herself with the help of, much to my surprise, Twilight Sparkle and her friends. It was kind of an honor to be partially mind-raped by a celebrity. I sighed and took the third book off the stand again. It's not like I was bitter, exactly. I knew she was only trying to help me, but I wished she had slowed down a bit and, I don't know, asked me if that was what I wanted. Maybe I'm just being a chicken, but I like to take things one step at a time. Now, getting excited was one thing, and totally understandable, but doing things safely had to take precedence. Of course, this was largely due to my own blundering into the village itself, so, I really should have prepared more before trying to observe them. Looking down at the third book, I smiled. Magic of the Lands, a practical look. It was older than the other two, but very beautifully maintained. Dutifully, I had saved it for last, deciding to go through the books in order. She probably hadn't intended that, but I guess I might be a little weird like that myself. I was a good fourth of the way through it by now, and fascinated by every word. Stepping back, however, I decided that it was probably a good thing that I had saved it for last. My mind had opened up a little by the time I got to it, and I wasn't in as big of a rush. The second book had corrected me significantly about a lot of the culture around me. There was a very big gap in the gender ratio. It was skewed heavily in favor of females, but it didn't really come up all that often in day-to-day lifestyle, it would seem. Stallions had just as much freedom to do whatever they wanted as the mares, and there wasn't any segregation like I thought there might be. Surprisingly, a large amount of crime that I might have anticipated was basically non-existent, save for in the largest cities. This was an amazingly peaceful world, at least compared to the foggy memories of my only other comparison. Part of me was happy that I was here, instead of there, and not just because I was alive. Another part of me was uneasy, however. I had nothing to my name, or lack thereof. No skills, no money, no place to live, and no friends. That last part of Twilight's letter always snagged me, no matter how many times I read it. My new friend? The mare who had seen the horror I barely remembered didn't seem like a likely candidate for friendship. Part of me was worried as to what she had told other ponies, but I heard nothing of the outside town regardless. Nobody had visited, which kind of made sense. I was a crazy little pony who showed up long enough to get his head caved in by a rock and then shuffled away to a hospital. That wasn't all that eventful, was it? Applejack and Rainbow Dash had jobs, friends. I wasn't one of those, so why would they visit? There was a certain bitterness I felt for not fitting in very well. I had stuck out way too much and royally screwed up by making all of those assumptions. This is a new world, totally unfamiliar to me, for the most part. Jumping to conclusions the way I did was the last thing I should have done, and that fact irritated me. But wasn't anything I could do about it now. I kept reading the book, absorbing all the information I could. It didn't tell me about spells or how to cast them, but I hadn't expected it to. Their system was quite different from what I had known, but I could apply what I knew easily enough. The wording had changed, the theory was totally unrelated, but I could make some healthy, educated guesses. Well, okay, healthy might not have been the best wording, especially if I actually tried to try some of this, but I'm sure you know what I meant. I made a mental note to stop talking to myself, as expecting an answer was the first sign of insanity, I supposed. Leafing through the next chapter, I noticed that I was getting out of theory and into practical applications. They used magic for most things in their day-to-day lives, it would seem, from producing the weather to more mundane things, like cooking. A lot of older technology was mixed in, however, and I was impressed by the foundation it all seemed to form. Their community was very stable. Sadly, without the ability to channel the energy outside of my body, there wasn't much I could really do, personally. Shifting to a more comfortable position, I nudged the pillows higher up and sat up against them. My back hardly even ached today, and I could tell that my body was recovering much faster than I had anticipated. I wonder if this is the norm for this new body. The small lamp next to me spread a soft glow over my bed, and I took my book back up again, smiling. I had kept very irregular hours, with the nurses urging me to sleep as much as I could. I had guessed that it was a few hours past midnight at this point. Reading for a few hours and then sleeping again sounded pleasant, in a lonely sort of way. I almost didn't hear the light tapping on the glass. My ears twitched and shifted towards the window above and to the left of my bed. After a few moments, there was another series of light taps, and I frowned before closing the book again. Raising an eyebrow, I decided to investigate and get this over with. If a tree grew that close to the window, why did they put a window there in the first place? Posterity? Oddly, I vaguely recalled looking out the window before. Just peeks through the blinds, of course, and I didn't remember a tree being there. There was a moment of surprise, followed by a sense of horror slowly sinking into the pit of my stomach as I saw the blue Pegasus outside my window. She looked tired, and her rainbow mane was pushed up against the glass as she watched me, both forehooves framing each side of her face. Slowly, I started retreating from the window, unable to help but remember the prismatic explosion that had almost killed me. Well, I knew that chances were she had no intention of doing that, but a more primitive part of my mind reasoned that it was dangerous to be this close to her. Rainbowdash's eyes widened and she shook her head rapidly, making a pawing motion with her right hoof. I stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. What was I doing, chickening out like this? My friends had already grinned into the face of death as far as I could tell, wherever they may be now. I'd be laughed out of the barracks if they saw me running away from a rainbow-colored pony. Swallowing, I stood more upright and walked back to the window, mustering a determined look. Dash smiled and nodded as I slid the lock on it gently to the side and opened the window a crack. She wasted no time in wedging her muzzle into the crack and forcefully nudging the window up. In less than a second, she touched down on my floor with a light flick of her wings. Damn, she was fast! Her hair flicked as she rapidly turned her body fully to face me. In my surprise from her sudden movement, I had fallen backwards and stumbled over and onto my bed again. Composing myself as best as I could, I rolled over onto my side and looked at her. There was a long and awkward silence where we just stared at each other. There wasn't any force behind her eyes at all, and she looked more like she was staring through me than at me. Finally, she gave her head an exasperated shake and huffed.
Okay, look, I'm not very good at this kind of thing, so I'll just come out and say it. I know Twilight told me to wait until you were up and moving again, but I saw your light on down here and didn't feel like waiting around anymore.
She rapidly released. To do what exactly? I asked wearily, starting to feel a bit fidgety again. I knew the book said their society didn't endorse violence or murder or anything like that, so I tried to keep my conclusions on a tighter leash this time. She let out an irritated sigh and gave me dagger looks.
Hold on a minute, will you? I don't do this often, so consider yourself lucky,
she declared, raising her head a little. I shrugged. I just thought you didn't feel like waiting around is all, I reminded, probably a little more bitterly than intended. Rainbow glared at me, looking serious this time. I backed away from her a little, remembering what she was capable of. Sorry, I hastily added. Her expression softened and she looked down again.
No, that's just what I came here for. Look,
She started before swallowing painfully, and finally finishing.
I'm sorry for dropping a bag of apples on your head and then hitting you while trying to land in that storm.
There was a long moment where she just stared at the floor. Rainbow Dash didn't seem like the type that apologized often, so I was a little surprised. I'm none the worse for wear, so no serious harm done, I guess. I forgive you, of course, I replied, after a bit of thought. She glanced up at me, eyes peeking through her bangs. My mouth dried a little when I realized how cute she was. Wait, no, bad hormones!
I wasn't talking about your body. I've never had some pony scared of me before. I just want there not to be any bad blood between us, you know? So, how about we start fresh?
She offered, raising her right forehoof towards me. After a few moments, I realized that she was right, in a kind of roundabout way. Even if she didn't want to say so, I sympathized. Having someone scared of me would leave an awfully bad taste in my mouth. Maybe she wasn't so bad after all. I smiled and nodded, pushing my hoof against hers and shaking with her. She smirked at this, and that familiar cocky expression returned.
Good. Oh, thanks, Celestia, that's over. I mean, it wasn't really bothering me, and was more AJ's idea, but I guess if you're gonna be hanging around for a while, having you cowering all the time would be bad, right?
She reasoned. Thankfully, I was lying down, or I might have fallen off the bed. You're really something, aren't you? I asked in disbelief, trying not to chuckle.
Well, of course I am. I'm Rainbow Dash, best flyer in Equestria,
she announced, hitting a hoof proudly to her chest. My overhead lights suddenly turned on, and I almost wet my bed in surprise.
Then you'd best show some speed in leaving, Miss Dash. Visiting hours are well done and over with,
I heard from the doorway, turning in time to see Nurse Redheart staring disapprovingly at her. Oh, crap. I didn't want to get Rainbow in trouble again. I'm sorry, Nurse Redheart. I let her in and I shouldn't have. I apologized, bowing my head to her.
No way. I showed up and was the one who wanted in. I just had something I really needed to talk to him about is all. I'll be taking off now,
Rainbow explained, smirking at the nurse. She didn't want to say that she had felt like apologizing, I saw. Respecting her wish, I nodded but kept my mouth shut. The nurse rolled her eyes but nodded.
Yeah, just use normal visiting hours next time, all right?
She requested, looking irritated. Frankly, I had forgotten that she lived upstairs above the 3-room clinic. Rainbow Dash threw her a sharp mock salute before looking over at me, winking, and adding,
Will do. See you later, okay? And think of a name for yourself.
And with that, she was gone out the still open window in the blink of an eye, leaving a shimmering rainbow trail in her wake. A name, huh? Nurse Redheart walked over and closed the window again, relocking it.
She's so stubborn. I take it you were already awake?
She asked, gesturing towards the book near my pillow with her head. I nodded weakly, looking at the book as well. Yeah, couldn't sleep. She saw my light on. I elaborated.
Only she didn't wake you to do whatever it was,
the nurse muttered, turning the overhead light off again. I smiled, remembering the cute mare. Needed to do something about this. There probably weren't many females in the military in my world, and my hormones were just going crazy. Maybe there was a spell that I could cast on my insides or something? I think I'll just go back to sleep for a while, I muttered, earning a gentle smile and a nod from the nurse. I turned off my bedside light as she slowly closed my door. Adjusting my saddlebags for probably the 10th time, I stood in front of the door to the library, looking up. Wearing these felt absurdly awkward, but they were really convenient. The nurse told me that Twilight had left them with the books the other day. Surprisingly, it was nice to wear something, even though they didn't cover much. I was still a little embarrassed about being naked. Apprehensive about seeing this particular mare, I hesitated when raising my hoof for the door. She had meant well, but could have been gentler about things. I didn't know what she thought of me, though. All was going well, until there was a sudden outburst to my side.
That's not how you knock on a door, silly.
I almost fell off the step in surprise.
This is much better.
A pink mare with an equally pink curly mane exclaimed suddenly from next to me. She then, to my shock, leapt at the door. She released a series of rapid-fire knocks, followed by a double stomp, a spinning kick, and finally a light rhythmic tapping.
Just a second, Pinky, relax. Yeesh.
Was shouted from inside. That sounded like a very irritated Twilight Sparkle. Seconds later, the door slammed open, and indeed a very irritated-looking Twilight Sparkle glared out at Pinky. I decided her name was very fitting, as she was extremely pink. Now that I looked, the only things about her that weren't pink were her eyes, which were light blue, and her cutie mark, which was 3 balloons of blue and yellow. She looked unfazed by Twilight's glare and beamed at her.
Hiya, Twilight,
she greeted, loudly. I was starting to notice a pattern. Twilight shook her head and then glanced over at me suddenly. Her expression shifted from anger to surprise, and then to a light blush as she regarded me.
Oh, hi. It's you. Do you want to come in?
She asked tentatively, as if she wasn't used to talking to ponies. Somehow, Pinky was in her face almost instantly, eyes bugging out in a suspicious manner. I hadn't even seen her move.
Ooh. Are you two hiding something? Are you getting all super duper lovey-dovey with him and not telling me?
She accused, her entire body twitching.
Oh, Pinkie Pie, don't be ridiculous. We're just friends,
Twilight explained, looking away from Pinky with a bit more of a blush. I felt heat rushing up into my cheeks too, regardless of the situation. Pinky suddenly wasn't there. I was shocked and really did fall off the steps this time as she practically landed on me, somehow from above.
Really? And what do you have to say about this, Mr. Mysterious Stallion? I've never seen you around town before,
she declared, giving me a stare that would surely haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. I have no idea what's going on, I offered, worried she was going to give me similar treatment as the door.
Pinky, he's my guest. You're being rude,
Twilight interjected, glaring at her as she stood on my side. Pinky didn't look like she was listening. She glared at me suspiciously for a few more moments before suddenly gasping as if a bird just flew up her.
Oh my! I haven't seen you around town before, and I know every pony around town. So that means that if I don't know, you're new here. We need a party.
She suddenly screamed out and was gone in a flash. I stared up at the lip of the library roof, still shaking. I felt like she had violated me somehow just by being there. Where did all of that energy come from? Surely she was breaking some law of the conservation of energy somewhere or something.
Oh dear, I'm sorry. She's like that with new ponies in town,
Twilight apologized, who came outside and helped me up. Ow! Oof. Thanks, Twilight. Does she always have that much energy? I asked wearily, looking back over my shoulder at the pink blur disappearing into town. Twilight sighed and nodded before turning and heading back into the building. I followed after her at a slower pace, trying to get the saddlebags on properly. They probably weren't fully attached to begin with, but I thought I'd done a pretty good job for my first try. The door closed quietly behind me, and a sign dangled down in the window reading "Out to Lunch." She wandered into a rather spacious main area. There was a set of stairs going up to what appeared to be a loft off on one side, but it seemed that the library was in the central area. That made sense. She wouldn't want library goers to have to wander through her house just to get to the books. She sat down quietly at one of the tables and nodded towards the chair across from her.
I was hoping you would visit me when you were feeling better. Did they just release you today?
Twilight asked as I sat down at her table. I nodded quietly before sliding the saddlebags off my back with my teeth and resting them on the table. Yeah, I was just released a half hour ago or so. Still not very used to walking yet, so it took me a bit to get over here. Thanks for the books, I added, attempting to not sound awkward. Twilight smiled at the books before nodding.
Books always entertain me, and I hazarded a guess that you liked reading. And you mean walking on 4 legs, right?
She asked, shifting her attention to me, still smiling. I had kind of assumed she'd be able to draw quite a few conclusions from our little memory session. Apparently I was a biped before I came here. Though you probably know about as much as I do about that, I muttered, sliding my hoof in circles on her table. I started slightly as a small plate suddenly slid my way, having not been paying attention to what she was doing. There was a sandwich on the plate, and some sort of fried, battered sticks, it looked like. Maybe similar to the fries in my memory.
I figured you'd be hungry, having just been released. Dandelion sandwich with hay fries. I'm not a very good cook. Sorry.
She explained. Probably better at it than I am, but thanks, I replied, chuckling at her expression. It was followed by, and I take it you haven't told any pony about me yet, right? Twilight shook her head while she took a bite of her own sandwich. I tried a bite of mine while she was preoccupied. It was surprisingly good, albeit a little sour.
No, I haven't told any pony else. It stays between us. Anything I find in your memories. Well, I'm sorry.
She apologized suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere. Huh? For what? I asked, unsure of her intent. My chest, I suddenly realized, relaxed as I ate. There was a previously unknown restless feeling that I'd been plagued with, that I'd just noticed, and a tense sensation in my muscles as I walked through town. But something was truly simplistic about just talking and eating a meal in this library. It felt like things weren't as complicated as I had thought, and that I could just relax. Twilight looked back up at me, a bit of guilt showing through in her eyes.
In truth, I'd only ever read about that magic. Never actually performed it. I used too much force and it probably hurt you. And I should have explained what I was doing more before I did it. I was just too excited to try out the spell. And I didn't consider your feelings in the matter.
She elaborated quietly. I looked at her for a long moment, but she kept staring toward the table, sandwich floating a little ways away from her head. Eventually, I sighed and shook my head. As long as you tell me what you're doing in the future, no harm done, right? I added, smiling again. Twilight's expression shifted to a grin, and she nodded before taking another bite of her sandwich. I idly wondered what was in these. The texture was that of some sort of flowers or something. Those dandelions she mentioned? Given my newfound diet, however, I guess I'd best get used to them. Then I remembered something. Question, did Pinkie Pie really mean it when she said she was planning a party? I suddenly asked. Twilight momentarily choked on her own sandwich before she started laughing.
Yeah, Pinky wouldn't be herself if she didn't throw new ponies a party. And put together one for every pony's birthdays. And holidays. And special events. And pretty much whenever she feels like having a party, which is most days.
She explained, unable to stop her snickering throughout. So she's throwing a party for me? I don't even have a name. Now what am I gonna do? I asked, now dreading the social event. I wasn't very good at socializing in normal circumstances, I felt. What was I going to do with a party thrown for me? Twilight kept smiling, though.
Well, I'm sure you can just pick something to call yourself, right? A name you really like? Or maybe something historical. Or you can ask us to help you think of one. Rarity or Applejack would probably be the most serious about it.
She offered. That struck a chord. I winced and looked down at the table again. I don't think Applejack likes me very much. Maybe I'll ask this Rarity pony, I contemplated. Twilight sighed and shook her head.
You two just got off to a bad start is all. That and she was worried you'd,
She started to explain, trailing off and frowning towards the end. I raised my head and looked at her again, frowning myself. Twilight seemed to understand and nodded without me asking.
I know. I'm on your side in this, and I understand why you acted the way you did. She was just concerned for her little sister and thought you might have done something to those 3 fillies, and that Apple Bloom just didn't want to say anything.
She finished, frowning again. My eyes widened, and I suddenly had difficulty swallowing my bite of sandwich with the lump in my throat. What? But why would I hurt them? I was just trying to get away at the time, I muttered, feeling a chilled sensation sinking in my stomach. She nodded in assurance.
I know. Applejack's just very protective, especially of her sister. When you mentioned, eating ponies, she apparently freaked out.
She explained, wincing at the thought herself. My appetite went away suddenly. No, I don't eat ponies. I thought that... Never mind. I tried to defend, giving up halfway through. She already said she understood my side. Defending myself was kinda pointless. Twilight nodded gently and finished off her sandwich, looking as if she was thinking about something. Feeling suddenly tired, I laid the side of my muzzle down on her table and stared at the sideways view of the couple bites left of my sandwich. I guess in my assumptions, it made a very bad impression. And it was at that point that reality started to sink in again. The facts were obvious. I died. The spell I had used had killed me. But something had happened in that instant of casting that caused something. Instead of dying, I was brought here. I don't know if a new body was formed or if my old one just changed, but I was a pony now. My world, however, for all practical purposes, was gone. Either destroyed or completely taken over. I didn't have a place to return to, even if I wanted to. I was stuck here. In this form, in this reality. This wasn't temporary, but something I needed to face as my new existence. The people here, ponies rather, were my new species.
Don't worry about Applejack. She'll come around soon enough. Rainbow Dash, Fluttershy, and I already vouched for you. That's gotta mean something to her.
Twilight reassured, after a few quiet seconds. Raising an eyebrow, I shifted my gaze to her. Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy too? I questioned, wondering why they did. I got an enthusiastic nod in return.
Yep. Rainbow Dash apparently visited you to apologize and you made a good impression. And Fluttershy said you had gentle eyes or something?
She added, looking a little perplexed at that last part. Great. I was blushing again. Fluttershy's eyes were beyond gentle after all, so she would know. I'd felt an indescribable calmness after locking eyes with her that time. I didn't know what to think of her, ultimately, but I was pretty sure it was good things. Suddenly, I snapped back to attention when I noticed Twilight was smirking at me. Hey, what? What? I denied, blushing harder and looking away.
Don't forget, I saw your memories. You bad boy, cute, isn't she?
Twilight asked, mirthful and amused. I buried my head in my hooves and groaned. Shush, 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 shush. Oh, it's been a while since I've interacted with girls, that's all, I protested, trying to regain my composure. Now, of course, that was just a guess on my part. I didn't actually have any idea how much interaction with females I'd had prior to coming here. Twilight snickered.
Relax, I'm just teasing you. Just be careful. She doesn't react to strangers very well. Get to be her friend before you try putting any moves on her, okay?
I don't want to put moves on in the first place. I probably won't do anything at all. I muttered, face still hidden. One would think I would remember a mate if I had had one. Of course, I didn't even recall my old friends, which is depressing enough. Given my age, maybe I'd never gotten one. Might as well just leave that as is for now. I was more interested in finding a way to not starve to death on the street, at least. There was a long moment of silence, and I got curious, finally glancing up at Twilight. She wore a soft smile as she looked down at me. Catching my gaze, she nodded.
I'm sorry. You must still be adjusting to things. But you seem nice. I shouldn't have needed Rainbow Dash to tell me that. But I guess I was just a little wary, given what I saw in your head.
She reasoned. What situation of my arrival? I asked, snuggling against my forelegs and feeling comfortable now that my stomach was telling my brain it had food in it. Twilight shook her head, though.
Given what you've been through, that would have turned a lot of ponies extremely bitter. Or worse. I'm glad that you're not like that,
she elaborated, smiling. I closed my eyes, suddenly feeling ready to fall asleep right there. Yeah, well, I think I can kind of recall it happening to others. Nothing specific. And at the end of the day, I'm just me. After I said it, I decided that probably sounded nonsensical. I had such a way with words, my mind retorted sardonically. Twilight just giggled, though.
You are indeed just you, and that's a good thing. Now, have you thought about what you're going to do? If you don't mind, of course, I'd like to do a few more sessions to try and bring your memories back. And I'd also like to investigate how you got here. All in good privacy, of course, and only with your permission.
She requested. I don't mind. I'm more worried about a place to stay and a way to get food, though, I explained, frowning again. I'm assuming they had some sort of currency here and that I could acquire it through labor or work or something, but getting a place to stay probably cost a lot more than what I could achieve in a little bit of time in the day. Meaning a bed for tonight was out of the question. Twilight thought for a moment before tentatively nodding.
I know how you feel, but you should hold off on work until you're fully recovered. You were only released earlier today. I would recommend you wait at least a week before you do anything too strenuous, okay?
She requested, sounding a little concerned. But how am I going to get any money? If I'm going to afford a place to stay and food to eat, I'm going to have to work, right? I asked, probably letting more worry through in my voice than I wanted.
You can stay with one of us for a while, of course. I don't have a lot of room here, but getting a cot or a hammock wouldn't be that hard. Besides, I want to run some tests on you anyway. I'll ask Applejack about maybe employing you on our farm after you recover. That's good work for an earth pony like you,
she said, almost as if thinking out loud. Sitting up again, I asked, "Are you sure Applejack would like that?" I was also concerned about making this up to Twilight, but something told me that she'd get a lot of enjoyment out of turning me into a guinea pig for her experiments. She was unfazed and just nodded.
Of course. Like I said, once we get her to see that you're a good guy, she'll be all for having competent work for the farm. They're always expanding the business, and you seem like you'd be a hard worker,
she promised. In truth, I was actually looking forward to the idea of doing some manual work that didn't involve killing something. The thought of that caused my stomach to tie itself into knots. I can't imagine I had made a very good soldier. And what about you? What do you want in return for me staying here? I asked hesitantly, unsure of how to go about this. Twilight shook her head.
You seem like you're going to be a good pony to be friends with, so don't worry about it. I don't mind company on occasion, and it'll be nice to have another pony to practice my spells on. Spike starts complaining if I use him too often,
she furthered, winking at me. I swallowed nervously, but nodded. Figures. She wanted a guinea pig. Wait, who is Spike? Wham! The door opened and a large stack of banners with 2 purple scaly legs walked in. Well, this was certainly an interesting new creature. Twilight watched the moving stack with a slightly confused expression, probably mirroring mine.
Spike, what is all of that?
She asked after a few seconds. The stack was set down on the floor, and a tiny purple fellow stepped around it. He was about half my height when I was standing, but very different. He had scales instead of a coat, he was a biped, he had claws for hands, and a purple ridged back and tail. Some kind of lizard? Well, I was over at Rarity's, helping her with things, and Pinkie Pie burst in and started getting fabric for a party. Then she hauled me halfway around Ponyville gathering supplies and sent me back here. Apparently there's a new pony in town. There were several awkward moments, followed by,
Wait, she's having it here?
Yep. She looked everywhere but couldn't figure out where the guy is supposed to live. So she just decided to lure him and surprise him here. Hey, who's that guy? Spike finally asked, looking at me after explaining. Twilight coughed and glanced back at me.
He's the new pony,
she muttered. Oh. Well, I suddenly felt awkward. Whoops. I wasn't supposed to have heard all of that. Spike looked amazingly like I felt, though. Oh, what? Oh, dang it. Now Pinkie's gonna be mad at me. Can you work some magic to make him forget or something? He protested. I'm pretty sure my already pale complexion got even paler at that point.
Spike! I don't use my magic for that,
she berated, before glancing back to me and asking,
I'm sorry, can you come back a little later? Apparently we're having the party here now.
I nodded, swallowing a bit uneasily. I'd not cherished the thought of going out there again, and completely naked this time. Twilight looked like she wanted to say something, but glanced at Spike and stayed quiet. She didn't want to discuss anything about my memories in front of him, it seemed. Understanding, I turned around and headed out before I further complicated her day.